So where do you go when your heart hurts? I mean, when you just ache to the core, where do you run? Do you run to the refrigerator? Do you run to a friend, call her up and tell her what's going on? Do you grab a glass of wine? Or do you curl up in bed and just kind of sleep it all away so you don't have to face it? Well, in the barrenness of her empty womb, Hannah ran to God. Right there in the temple in Shiloh, she ran to him, and like Lamentations 2:19 says, she poured out her heart like water before the presence of the Lord. And I want to look at her prayer right here. We're still in 1 Samuel chapter 1, down at verse 10. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord. And she made a vow, saying, O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all of the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Now that last part, that's a Nazirite vow, and that's another discussion. But what I want to look at is the heart of Hannah that she shows in this prayer. The very first thing is what she calls God. She cries out to him directly as Lord Almighty. Some of your translations might say Lord of Hosts, but it comes from the Hebrew words Jehovah Sabaoth, which literally means Lord of armies. And whether that's earthly armies or heavenly armies, honestly, I don't think Hannah really cares about that, because what she knows is the power that Jehovah Sabaoth implies. And she knows that she is in the presence of the one who has the power to change her life. I mean, she would know all of the stories of old. She would know about Abraham and Sarah and how in their old age God promised them a son, but that they waited 20 to 25 years before Isaac was born. And then Isaac's wife Rebekah was also barren, and Isaac prayed to God, and God opened her womb and gave them twins. And then Jacob had a barren wife, Rachel, the love of his life, and she had to sit by while his other wife, Leah, had 6 sons, one by one by one, until God opened her womb and gave them Joseph. And so Hannah would know these stories, and she would know the power of what God is capable of doing, and she dares to ask a great God for a great miracle. One of my favorite parts of this prayer, though, is just below that, when she says, remember me. Remember me. It's almost so insignificant that we don't even notice it. I mean, we say the word remember a lot in our world. We talk about, oh, I make a list, so I can remember because I'm going to forget this. Usually we're saying we didn't remember. I'm always telling my girls, remind me, because I know when I get home I'm not going to remember this. So remind me. Remembering is just, it's something we say all the time, and it's something we don't do all the time too. But it's very significant when we find that in Scripture there are only 4 times before Hannah's life where the word specifically says that God remembered. The first is all the way back in Genesis chapter 8, the flood. Noah's been out on the ark. In fact, right before chapter 8 it says, the waters flooded the earth for 150 days. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock, and he sent a wind to come and dry up all that flood water. Flip over a few chapters to chapter 19, and we find the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, 2 evil cities in the Old Testament. And in chapter 19, verse 20, so when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe, his nephew. He remembered Abraham. Flip over a few more to Genesis chapter 30, verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and opened her womb. Hannah would totally love that story. And one more time in Exodus, the beginning of Exodus, God had been silent with the Israelites for 400 years. They'd become slaves in Egypt and were living an awful life. And it says in chapter 2, verse 24, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And he sent Moses to come and face Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And there's only one other person before Hannah's life who actually asked to be remembered by God. And that is Samson in the book of Judges. You know, strong Samson with the long hair. Well, at this point, Delilah had betrayed him. She'd cut his hair. He'd been handed over and captured by the Philistines. They gouged out both of his eyes, and they had him shackled to a Philistine temple where the Philistines were inside and on top of the roofs that you could stand on. And he was in humiliation shackled there. And we find in Judges 16, in verse 28, Samson's prayer when he says, "O sovereign Lord, remember me. Oh God, please strengthen me just once more." And he did. God remembered him. And Samson pushed on those pillars, and that temple came crashing down. And he killed more Philistines in his death than he ever had in all of the battles in his life. And so when Hannah asked for God to remember her, she knows that this is a remembrance of action. Not just keep me in mind, but a remembrance of action. She knows that her Jehovah Sabaoth has the power to not only remember her, but to act on her behalf. And I love that she is this humble, barren woman who goes before her God and trust him to be that Jehovah Sabaoth and to remember her. And he remembers you and I today. He remembers us. But do we trust him to be our Jehovah Sabaoth even now?